So thank you everyone for joining us. I want to just welcome everyone and to give a little bit of a sense of what we're going to do today. So I hope that everyone's heard the news that ENDA has been introduced as of this morning. So I don't know if you all feel better already, but I feel qualitatively different. That's not true. I don't feel different at all. I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Cronk. I work with GetEQUAL. I'm very excited to have this conversation today. It's really a kickoff for ENDA and as a kind of rallying point and discussion point for not only why the bill is needed, but the people who the bill would impact. And as a grassroots organization, we see and hear and feel that every single day. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We're going to each take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to kind of give a little bit of a sense of our work and our perspective and what our various organizations and experiences are bringing to the fore. But then we're really going to kick it to discussion. And we're videoing this, so we'll post this online as well, so the folks across the country can participate in the conversation virtually, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So if we can just go down the line, starting this way. Let's just do quick introductions, and then we'll get started with Liz first. So Tico, if you could introduce.
Sure. I'm Tico Almeida. I'm president of Freedom to Work, which is an LGBT advocacy organization that focuses specifically on ENDA and workplace protections for LGBT Americans.
Great. I'm Mottet. I'm the Transgender Civil Rights Project Director at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force.
I'm Colleen. I'm the Policy Fellow at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, and we advocate on behalf of the LGBT business community.
I'm Beyer. I'm Executive Director of Gender Rights Maryland and an Advisory Board member of Freedom to Work.
Cronk, Co-Director of GetEQUAL.
Bella Abzug, a lawyer and founder, actually, of the Bella Abzug Leadership Institute.
All right, so we'll get started by actually punting to Liz first, talk a little bit about her history of the bill, with the bill, her mother's legacy with the bill, and what the bill means in contemporary terms.
Yes, thank you, Heather. My mother, former Congresswoman Bella Abzug from New York, in 1974, introduced the Equality Act, very boldly, so I'd say, which was the first bill to create protections for LGBT, citizens at the time. And I just by way of background, I worked when I got out of law school for the Office for Civil Rights for Jimmy Carter under the Carter administration in New York, and then became a senior official of our state division of human rights, both in New York and New Jersey. So I have a long commitment to civil rights and enforcement of civil rights. And Heather had gotten in touch with me about the efforts here, and I've been tracking ENDA for a long time and have felt in the New York area and with my friends across the country that it's wonderful that we have gotten marriage equality in the states that we've won it, but that it's always been my feeling in my work that we need to get ENDA passed or even extend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's been some meetings about that to include LGBTQ protections, meaning the original Civil Rights Act. I think that was my mother's strategy too, because in the 70s, after the Civil Rights Act was passed to create protections based on discrimination based on race, in 1970s, the people in Congress, women and some of the more progressive men, made sure that Title VII included protections for women against discrimination. And many people felt that the next stage, obviously, right after that would be, I'm talking about in the 70s, LGBT rights, okay, believe it or not. And so then we go forward to the president, and this is where I want to speak to. I've had meetings with some colleagues in New York with Congressman Nadler's office, with Carolyn Maloney. You know, these are old friends of mine, and we talked about with Nadler, this was just about a year ago, and when Barney Frank actually came to New York, and a group of activists met with him and Carolyn Maloney and Congressman Nadler to talk about the notion of getting ENDA passed and the enforcement elements of it, to make sure that we have the right enforcement elements, because that's my interest, you know, in the law, in the proposed law. But also the notion of maybe extending the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a way in which to galvanize support of movement around the country. Obviously today is a great day, I mean, ENDA's introduced, but how do we pressure? It's been my, and Heather and I talked about this weekly, my concern that many people, outside people in this room and others who are really involved with this, don't understand still the importance. A lot of young people feel that marriage equality is it, and don't understand the importance of, sure, everybody understands the importance of not being discriminated against in a job, but understand that this is a federal right as opposed to a state right, and that we need to, it's an umbrella, in my view, and I'm sure all of you, it's an umbrella that would ensure, you know, the beginnings of our full equality beyond marriage, which has been wonderful. But, and I've had this conversation, I'll be very frank with you, with Evan Wolfson and many people in the civil rights area in New York, and in the Human Rights Campaign, the previous director, about the fact that I think, you know, we need to focus in this broader way. I mean, yes, on ENDA, for sure, as the first step, but in a broader way to sort of, fire up the movement of younger people, in addition to those of us who've been working on these issues for a long time.
Great. We have an endorsement. Liz Abzug wants full equality. I love it.
Well, as a gay woman, and as someone who has 40 years later, I mean, just think about this, 40 years later, when my mother took a very bold step in Koch and everybody jumped on the bandwagon there to introduce this bill, and people thought she was out of her mind, but don't forget that it was New York, the activism, you know, we're talking obviously a few years after Stonewall across the country, the fact that my mother was radical but also a civil rights lawyer, and who really understood that not only civil rights meant civil rights for all, and as a feminist leader, yes she was, but she understood that, you know, gay rights, it's not complete until, you know, we stand up, and she stood up, and the congressional people who did, to try to establish this. And people thought she was out of her mind. She was only in there for 2 terms when she first introduced this, all right? So, you know, people are looking at her like, what, are you crazy? You know, you have to realize that this was her second term in the, you know, sort of in the early part. She was only in there in the House for 3 terms. And it was the height of a lot of activity vis-a-vis a lot of other issues, you know, Watergate, Nixon, impeachment that she was pushing forward because of the war, the end of the war, or, you know, at that time. So all I got to say is that a piece of history that when there was Anita Bryant and that whole thing happened, all of a sudden in the middle of the night, about 300 gay men and women came to my parents' house in the village in the middle of the night with candlelight and yelled her name, come out, help us. And this is a piece of history. She went out in her, she thought she heard this, and she said to my father, who was sleeping, I think there's this whole mass of men outside. This is a true story. And he said, go to sleep, Bella, you're hearing things. And she got up and said, no, I hear this protest, I hear it. And so she went out on the stoop in her nightgown. This is a true story. And there everybody was in Bank Street in the West Village of New York protesting and saying, help us, help us, help us. And so the commitment in my family, obviously, is very deep. And my personal commitment is to make sure that we get the broadest protections. I mean, not only in employment, housing. And so I had started a couple of years ago with this notion of trying to talk about getting it in the past, but maybe even getting it into the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So that's, well, thank you for, listening, and I'm glad to be here to hear what everybody else has to say.
Thanks so much, Liz. Tico, let me hand it off to you.
Sure, and thank you. Last year, a friend of mine who lobbies on ENDA was walking the halls of Capitol Hill, doing lobbying, and a senator who's been in the U.S. Senate for many, many, many years knows him, saw him, came up and greeted him and said, hello, so-and-so, what are you up here working on today? And he said, Senator, well, I'm lobbying for ENDA. And the senator, who's been there for decades, got a puzzled look and said, ENDA? I thought we passed that years ago. So this misconception is not just among the American people, it's among the legislators who are supposed to be addressing these problems. And I think part of the reason that exists is that it's been far, far too long since the Senate actually took up the bill and debated it. 17 years since the last vote in 1996, which is an absurdly long pause between Senate votes and Senate debates. And it's been I think it's worth noting that it's been 7 years since the Democratic Party has controlled the Senate, and they have so far not chosen to bring the bill to a vote. They could have done it last year, the year before, and they've chosen not to, and that's a problem. The good news is that our push from all of these organizations and many others is starting to gain headway, and there's a very strong commitment this year from leaders like Senator Merkley and Kirk to push the bill. Mr. Harkin, who chairs the Health Committee, has vowed very publicly that he is holding a markup as soon as May or June, and that sets us up to get the bill to the floor as early as July. I think this summer could be a very opportune time to have this national debate triggered by a Senate vote on ENDA, because right after the Supreme Court ruling in Windsor and in Perry, where I, like many others, am optimistic that we could have a good result, many right-wingers are going to say, well, I want to protect the traditional definition of marriage, but of course I don't believe in discrimination against gay people or transgender people or anybody. And I think that's the moment when you want to call those bluffs and say, okay, if that's true, here's a bill that we've got ready on the Senate floor. It's very simple, it just says you can't fire people because of who they are or who they love. Do you, in fact, vote for it? So I really think that in this year, 2013, as we are going to make progress on marriage equality, it's time to have ENDA teed up. And like many of the senators who are leading this charge, I'm also optimistic that we can cross 60 votes and defeat a filibuster. And I actually look forward to, and I think there's a benefit to our movement, to having that filibuster attempted and take place. Because one thing we haven't had on ENDA is strong vocal opposition. And our side actually wins when the other side talks. So you'll notice that a year ago there was a Senate committee hearing on ENDA, and not a single Republican showed up to oppose the bill. I think they're afraid to oppose it, and I think they know that their talking points are not winning ones. They're not talking points that'll connect with the American people, so they choose silence. So by bringing the bill to the floor, you force them to take a position when they would rather be silent. And when some of the dumb things that some members of the Congress would say could actually hurt their side. We're seeing that in immigration reform. The immigration bill is barreling forward in a very good way, and it's triggered certain Republican members to say pretty racist and inflammatory things that the American people don't agree with, and that hurts their side. It hurts the opposition. And I think we want that same dynamic in ENDA. We want the Michelle Bachmans of the world talking. We want Tom Coburn talking and saying dumb things that the mainstream media will latch onto, so that we can, connect our values and our arguments, which are the winning ones, with the American people. So I am optimistic that 2013 can be a very good year for progress. And I also want to throw out there that I know there's concern and realism about what can be done in the House, but coming off of a big 60-plus vote victory in the Senate on ENDA, I think there's a very worthwhile organizing campaign around a discharge petition, which is something that the lead sponsors, Mr. Polis and Congresswoman Layton, could start the day after a successful Senate vote, where they start a petition on the floor of the well of the House. You need to get to 218 signatures to essentially go around the opposition and the blocking of Speaker Beyer, and that automatically would take ENDA to the floor of the House for a vote. We may or may not get to 218 signatures, but that organizing campaign, that process of our movement pushing for members to sign the discharge petition is a worthwhile thing that I think grows strength in our movement, that creates publicity and public education for this issue, and that is a worthwhile endeavor that I hope will happen in 2013 as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Tico. Dana, why don't you
It is a pleasure to be here with this illustrious panel, and particularly to meet you, Professor Abzug. I worked for Councilmember Dutchy Trachtenberg in Montgomery County Council back during the last session, and she modeled herself after your mom. But I think the important thing about Congresswoman Abzug is you said she only served 3 terms. We don't sense that that's the case. She was a leader. In 3 terms, in 6 years, she did far more than most Congress people do, sometimes when they serve for 3 or 4 decades. And I think that's something that our elected representatives should really take to heart. It's not about getting reelected, it's about standing up even in the beginning of your 2nd term and doing what's right. And being a model and changing the culture, because a lot of what we're talking about here, it's not about the law, it's about changing the culture so that the law becomes unnecessary. 90% of Americans think that we already have protections. Well, that's a really good thing. That means that it's less likely that anybody is going to discriminate against LGBT people. We can use that and pivot from it and use that as a positive impetus rather than approaching this from fear, as we often have, because so many of us get beaten, assaulted, fired, and kicked out of our homes, but saying, look at all the progress we've made, and we need to use that from the marriage perspective as well. All these victories give us the power to come out and say, we're here. Let's get this done. We're equals. Now, I'm here as the trans person on the panel, so I'll say a little bit from that perspective. It's been interesting to me, since trans people are covered now under Title VII in all 50 states and the territories, that my goal is to make sure that no gays get left behind. And I think it's important. We don't talk about an inclusive ENDA anymore. You may have noticed, Mara Kiesling made the comment earlier today that, she's the executive director of the National Center for Trans Equality, that we don't talk about an inclusive ENDA. That battle was fought 6 years ago and won. Now we just talk about ENDA. The thought that it might be exclusive is simply not in anybody's mind. We're just doing this. We're moving forward with it. That's a very important change in attitude. But so Title VII and other federal court decisions have made it clear that we are covered now. Trans people and gender nonconforming people are covered under Title VII. And I was thinking as I was driving in here, well, that means we need to cover gender-conforming gay and lesbian people. But then I recognized that I am a gender-conforming gay woman, who just happens to be trans. I mean, I am a gender-conforming gay woman who, because I transition gender, am covered under the law now, whereas a gender-conforming gay woman such as yourself, who didn't transition, is not. That's the height of absurdity. And that gets back to the misconceptions that most Americans have about human sexuality. Your mother fought for an inclusive world where civil rights covered everybody. Even Dick Cheney said freedom means freedom for everybody. This, sexual orientation is separate, and the courts view that in a different manner versus now being trans is considered sex discrimination under heightened scrutiny. All these issues are really obscuring the main point, is that we're all different in our human sexuality. How we define that may vary in time in order to help us make certain progress. Marriage equality is fundamentally based on sexual orientation, but gay people are far more than just their sexual orientation, right? So this is a new opportunity for us from a position of strength to move forward, to move ENDA forward as an educational tool, as a way of bringing the entire community together. Instead of 6 years ago, we were split apart and came together with United ENDA. Now we can go forward together, and I'm hopeful with that. And also, Tico, you didn't mention the executive order, which trans people are now covered under President Johnson's executive order. It's time that President Obama put out that executive order, which covers all gender-conforming gay and lesbian people as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dana. Colleen, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me here today. My job working at National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce is to make the business argument for ENDA. For the past 10 years, we've worked to ensure that at the corporate level or with small businesses that we have an accessible, fair, and LGBT inclusive workforce in the United States. NGLCC works with federal agencies to ensure that federal contracting avenues are open and accessible to LGBT business owners. Last year, we've worked with the Department of Commerce and were successful in passing a memorandum of understanding. We're currently working with our colleagues at the Department of Labor and the Department of Defense. A federal employee non-discrimination act is imperative in this economy. Job security and talent retention are essential components to success for any business, big or small. And at the Chamber, we work to ensure that LGBT people do not have to choose between being somebody else or choosing to hide who they love versus choosing where they would like to work, either as an employee or as a small business owner in the procurement chain. Economic success is not about enabling easy discrimination, but instead harnessing the collective diversity of the people who make the business successful. It should be noted that more than 87% of Fortune 500 companies already recognize sexual orientation in their non-discrimination policies, and over 57% of them also prohibit discrimination based on gender identity. They recognize that discrimination is economically an unwise business practice. Corporations and small businesses understand that diversity is an asset and discrimination cannot be tolerated in the workplace. Businesses will be more productive when all employees can bring their full selves to work. Of small business owners that have non-discrimination policy in place, they have reported that there are virtually no costs associated with implementing and maintaining these policies. And in fact, research indicates that non-discrimination policies are a net positive for large and small businesses. And at NGLCC, we work with a variety of corporate partners, about 140 of them, that work to ensure that they have non-discrimination policy in place, not only for their employees, but throughout the entire supply chain. And just to note a few of them, they're our biggest advocates and real champions for LGBT inclusion in the workforce, and they include American Airlines, Wells Fargo, IBM, JP Morgan Chase, Accenture, Ernst & Young, and Google, just to name a few. So we are urging the Senate to approve ENDA and uphold it and making it the workplace a fair game for all LGBT people, no matter where they choose to work. Without ENDA, we are closing off business from a profitable consumer market of LGBT people and their allies. Our government should be working to ensure security for everyday Americans by allowing them to freely contribute to our economic growth, and we can no longer wait for this common sense, good business practice.
Great, thanks so much, Colleen. Lisa, let's do it next.
Absolutely. So I'm Lisa Mottet. I'm the Transgender Civil Rights Project Director at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and I'm going to talk a little bit about state and local laws, as well as data from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. So the first thing to know is we have a patchwork of state and local laws. Right now we have 16 states plus DC that have LGBT protections. Additional 5 states have sexual orientation. There are also over 160 cities that have LGBT protections at the local level. And there's been a lot of growth in the non-discrimination protections at the state and local level over the past few years. For example, well, the first law actually passed in 1982 in Wisconsin that had sexual orientation, which just goes to point out how forward-thinking Congresswoman Abzug was in 1974. There wasn't even a state who had done this, not until 1982. But if you look at since I work on transgender rights, I'm going to just tell you about how we've gained so many more protections for trans people. If you look at the year 2000, about 5% of the country was lived in one of the jurisdictions that had a non-discrimination law covering trans people. So 5% in 2000. Today we're at 45% of the country being covered. That was going from 1 state to 16 states, and a handful of localities to over 160 localities. If you're curious about what the equivalent number for sexual orientation is, it's 52%. So the difference between LGBT at 45 and then sexual orientation is only about 7% of the country has a sexual orientation only law. So there's been a lot of growth, and the community and the movement has really done a great job ensuring that our protections are inclusive at the state and local level. However, it is still a patchwork. Obviously, there's a lot of protections in the Northeast and the West and in some of the middle states, but not so many in the South. And it is incredibly absurd for people to be driving around the country and not know where they have protections and where they don't. I also do want to mention that Dana referred to the EEOC decision and some of the federal court decisions around gender identity and transgender people being protected under sex discrimination. There have actually also been some court decisions that say that sexual orientation is a part of sex discrimination. So although the decisions have been stronger when related to transgender people, there are also decisions saying that LGBT people, based on sexual orientation, discrimination based on sexual orientation is a type of sex discrimination. And we certainly agree, and we think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that discriminates that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex should be interpreted to cover all LGBT people. But yet the Supreme Court has not done that, and we have these patchwork of state and local laws. That's why we need a clear federal law for everyone in our community. Going to the data from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, this is a groundbreaking survey that was put out in 2011 by my organization, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, in partnership with the National Center for Transgender Equality. It surveyed over 6,400 transgender people in the U.S. This is the full report here about experience of discrimination in all areas of life. And, you know, I've actually worked in the transgender rights field for over a decade. The first 10 years of that work, I did not have any data. We knew the discrimination was bad. We had all these anecdotal stories about what happens when a person undergoes gender transition. They're likely fired, et cetera. There's kind of a predictable chain of events that happens. Well, the survey actually gave us real data to actually describe what's going on. And we were, even the advocates who were used to and worked in this field were surprised about the level of discrimination that transgender people were actually facing on the job. The first number to know is 90%. 90% of transgender people experienced either mistreatment, harassment, discrimination at work, or hid who they were to avoid it. 26% said they lost a job just because they were transgender, so basically being fired or laid off just because they were transgender. We found that 50% had been harassed at work for being trans, and 44% reported that they were not, 44% reported they were underemployed. Interestingly, we asked about access to restrooms at work, and 80% of transgender people reported being given access to gender-appropriate restrooms at work, which was actually a surprise to us, and it was a good surprise. It showed us that most employers are treating transgender people respectfully, and there's just this 20%, approximately, that are not being respectful and denying folks appropriate access to restrooms. All of this employment discrimination, though, translates into higher unemployment and higher poverty. For example, the trans community experienced double the rate of unemployment as the general population. Importantly, people of color had even higher rates of unemployment. So, for example, transgender African American workers had 4 times the rate of unemployment than the general American rate of unemployment. And similarly for Latina workers, and who had 3 times rate of unemployment. And the other problem that we were able to detect is we asked folks if they ever joined the underground economy, usually selling drugs or doing sex work in order to survive. 16% said they had been compelled to engage in some type of underground employment for income, which was 11% turning to sex work, the rest turning to selling drugs. Overall, I hope this is painting a picture for you about the pervasiveness of employment discrimination that transgender people face. We need a culture change in this country, the type of culture change that a federal law, passage of federal law should trigger. We're hopeful that if ENDA passes, all those HR people and all those HR attorneys out there will make sure that Their employers have non-discrimination policies, those policies are enforced, that staff is trained, hiring officers, co-workers, that harassment is not tolerated, and that's why we are so strongly in support of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Again, I'm Heather with GetEQUAL, and I'm not a number cruncher, I'm not a lobbyist, I'm an organizer, so I know stories. I'll tell you a little bit of my own story and then some of the stories that we've heard from across the country. I shared this with our community earlier in the week, but work has always been super, super fundamental to who I am and kind of how I see the world. And one of my actually earlier memories is being 7 years old in Mrs. Ford's second grade class, Stonewall Elementary in Kentucky. And we were assigned to go home and look at the newspaper and bring back a clipping of a story that interested us, right? So the intention was get us interested in current events, get us reading, you talk to your parents. I went to the classified section and I brought in a posting for a housekeeper. Because, when you're a second grade, why wouldn't you want to work as a housekeeper? But that was like how far back my desire, my need, my want to work goes. That's always been fundamental to me. When I was in college, I was taking a full load of classes and working 3 jobs just because I liked to work. And so for me, I can't imagine the reality for a lot of folks in our community to not be able to do that. It's not that we don't want to have jobs, it's not that we're trying to live off the system, it's that we can't get them. So for me, passing ENDA is just a matter of human decency. Yes, it's a civil rights issue, yes, it's a legislative issue, yes, it's a legal issue, but it's also just a human issue, and not having the ability or the freedom to work, I think, is just kind of core to being human and being American. I think Lisa hit a little bit on the absurdity of the patchwork of state laws that we have right now. State laws, city laws, county laws. We've had organizers, one who moved from New Mexico to Florida, from a state that had protections to a state that didn't have protections. So what happens if he gets fired and his partner and his child, don't have that stability in their home? We have an organizer who's a truck driver who regularly goes between different states on that route. What happens if you're discriminated against in one state, but then not in another state, but your employer's in another state? It's just all really confusing. And even if there are legal answers to that, there aren't human answers to that. There aren't, there isn't clear guidance, right? A federal law tells employees and tells employers, it's not okay. It's not okay in Texas, it's not okay in New Mexico, it's not okay in Kentucky. So what we're looking for is a way for folks just to know you can or you cannot discriminate in this country based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So for us, it's just a matter of wanting clarity, of wanting human clarity, of feeling like the country, should give us that clarity and make it fully legal to work in the place where you want to. So I don't want to delay the conversation anymore. I'll just say thank you to all the panelists who have kind of set the context. But what we really wanted to do was provide an opportunity to ask questions, to give your own story, talk about why this is an important issue, and why you all showed up to have the conversation today. So I'll get out of the way and open it up for conversation.
Yeah, I've got a question. I'm Ken Hoover. I write for a chain of 40 business journals around the country. And I remember back, I think it was 2007, one of the times ENDA was introduced. And there were a lot of endorsements from some, the Fortune 500, a lot of Fortune 500 companies like the ones you mentioned. But it seemed like the big, business lobbying organizations in town, like the U.S. Chamber, at best, were neutral. I think they mainly all kind of stayed on the sidelines. Do you have any hopes or efforts this year to actually get endorsements from various business organizations in order to help, get this over the finish line? Or do you think they'll stay kind of on the sidelines?
Sorry.
If you want to go for it, yeah.
The Chamber's neutrality is a victory. The neutrality of the National Association of Manufacturers is a victory. The neutrality of all of these business associations is a huge victory for ENDA, because the norm in Washington, D.C. is that the Chamber and the National Association of Manufacturers and all of the other business associations oppose expansions of workplace rights that, like ENDA. So this is a rare exception where they have said, we do not oppose ENDA. They stay neutral on it. And that is a huge victory that allows Republican senators and Republican members of the House to vote in favor of ENDA. I think it is the Chamber's neutrality that allowed Paul Ryan in 2007 to vote for a prior version of ENDA. If the Chamber had been opposed, there is no way that Paul Ryan ever would have voted yes on that bill. He was able to do so because the Chamber stayed neutral. And once we have this Senate vote, I think there are a significant handful of Republicans who will vote yes, and that yes vote is left open and possible because of the Chamber's neutrality, which again I think is a huge victory.
Tico, aren't there corporations that actually do it?
Yes, and I will turn over to the Gay and Lesbian Chamber to reiterate that point.
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with all of those statements that Tico just stated. I know as an organization, we're very focused on working with agencies and making sure that they're working with procurement and the supply chain, and also with corporations. We're not in the business of, changing policy of our other, partners and organizations, other type of business organizations. We're just very focused on making sure that businesses are open, accessible, and fair for all LGBT people.
Can you list those some of the ones that have endorsed ENDA? You mentioned some.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can repeat them again. American Airlines, Wells Fargo, IBM, JP Morgan Chase, Accenture, Ernst & Young, Google, Marriott. I can keep going, but there's many more.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing, because when I did write about it last time, I told Heather earlier an email that I got was, it was, from a business owner, very, conservative Christian business owner, wanted to run his business as a Christian business, and he was very upset that somebody could tell him that, that he would have to hire people that he didn't think were morally fit to be in it. And I know, obviously the religious exclusion doesn't cover a non-religious organization, but I think we're still going to get some pushback from folks like this person. What's your argument, the counter argument to a person like that?
I would say it's simply about education and just making sure that it's very clear about what the new religious exemption is and explaining where it actually falls.
What is that exemption? I'm just not.
Tico, you want to take that?
Sure. So, for-profit entities like the one you described will be covered by ENDA, no matter what the individual beliefs of the owner of the for-profit entity. So just, what that for-profit business owner didn't mention is that he is not allowed, under Title VII, to refuse to hire Jewish people, or Seventh-day Adventists, or non-believers. He, for 40 years, has lived under that rule, and he apparently didn't complain about that. He wants to now.
Would rather he, didn't have to.
Right. ENDA's religious exemption, as currently drafted, says that if you qualify, if a religious entity qualifies for the religious exemption under Title VII, you automatically also qualify for the religious exemption under ENDA. In other words, there will be a 100% match in terms of the universe and scope of entities that qualify under Title VII and will qualify under ENDA. That has been the ENDA, in terms of history, that has been the ENDA language since November of 2007, when Congressman George Miller offered an amendment on the floor of the House with this specific language, and it won incredible widespread bipartisan support. From the far left to the far right voted for this very language. So on the progressive side, you had Nancy Pelosi, George Miller, Barney Frank, Tammy Baldwin, now Senator Tammy Baldwin when she was then in the House. You had civil libertarians like Bobby Scott and Jerry Nadler and John Conyers. You had progressive caucus leaders, Javier Becerra, Linda Sanchez, Lynn Woolsey. Actually, I'm not sure about Lynn Woolsey, so scratch that one. You had the left flank voting for this version of the religious exemption, And you had the most conservative leaders and all of Republican leadership voting for it too. So it got John Boehner, Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan, Roy Blunt down the line. There was only a tiny handful of people who voted against it, and I actually have not been able to figure out why or what their philosophy is, but if you can read anything into this, Michelle Bachmann didn't like it. So you had the most progressive leaders, the most conservative leaders voting for it. Michelle Bachmann voted no. I don't know what that means, but I actually would love it if one of the reporters here asked her why she opposed this version. I will leave it there.
And let me actually add more things. Tico and I have talked about this before. That doesn't mean that we can't fight to change that exemption, the scope of it in committee, right? So that's where amendments are offered. That's where bills become stronger, unfortunately, for the most part. That's also where bills become weaker. But that's what the committee process is for. That's what the amendment process is for. So supporting this bill and moving forward on this bill doesn't preclude the amendment process.
Who's in charge of the whole shebang?
You are, Mike.
You were.
Hey, I got Mark Kirk to move. No. Is there, because I think in '07 we recognized that there was, we saw that. Are there thoughts about, is there like a central leadership thing? Is that something that we're, no?
Well, I mean, what we have now is, a landscape within the movement where we have lobbyists, we have grassroots groups, we have legal groups, we have service groups. I think all of those folks are interested in seeing ENDA pass in some version or another, right? So I don't think that anyone is calling the shots. Any one organization, any one person is saying, this is what's going to happen, everybody else fall in line. We no longer have that kind of political landscape within the movement. So
frankly, it looked better for us on the last hotel that we didn't have that political landscape.
yeah.
Can I add one thing about amendments? And then actually, I have a 1 o'clock that I actually have to make, so I'm going to leave after this, so I apologize for that. But anyone can follow, any reporters can follow with me if they want. I'm glad Heather mentioned that the markup process will be a time for additional changes to ENDA. And one that I want to flag is in 2009, there was a horrible decision by the Supreme Court called Gross v. FBL Financial, which created a big legal loophole in the age discrimination statute. It was a 5-4 decision. Wrongly decided, in my opinion, but it hurt age plaintiffs. And if that loophole is not closed, it will also hurt ENDA plaintiffs. It creates an unequal standard of proof and a harder standard of proof for ENDA plaintiffs than currently exists under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. I wish ENDA's sponsors had fixed the loophole for what they introduced today. They did not. But I think there is a possibility for fixing that loophole at markup. It's critically important that we do, and as I said, if we don't fix the loophole, there will be trans plaintiffs, there will be gay plaintiffs who lose their cases when they should have won because the loophole was not fixed and because they were held to a higher standard of proof than exists under Title VII. There should be parity and equality, and that is an important thing to get fixed before this becomes law.
On the topic of changes, I just wanted to point out that there have been a number of changes to this version of the bill. Basically, the ENDA's language has stayed quite similar over the past 20 or so years. But there have been obviously some major changes over time. Obviously, gender identity was added in 2007, for example. However, there were some small technical changes that were made, and if anyone wants details on that, we've detailed them on the task force blog. And we explain the minor changes in statistics, employer rules and policies around sexual harassment. DOMA language has been removed, purposes changes.
One thing regarding changes, I mean, in previous versions of ENDA, I believe that small businesses that had 15 or fewer employees were exempt from ENDA. Does that continue? And if it discontinues, is that do you have any concern that there is so much employment now for small businesses?
It does continue. That is parallel with Title VII and the Civil Rights Act. That's, the 15 employer threshold has been law for 40-some years. It should be law in the parallel way under ENDA as well.
Other questions, thoughts, comments, stories?
What's that, is there, just my only other question, is there like a schedule of things that we can reach out to people and get them to do because each of us has, in our own way, constituencies, that is there a clearinghouse or a place that we'll be able to feed, we need people to do this now, or things like that, or?
Well, I'm sure that many of our organizations are going to be involved with that. With GetEQUAL, we're using Act On principles to put a public whip count up, because we want people to be able to reach out to their legislators and not have that hidden behind organizational walls. So we'll be posting that. It's actually already up on the Senate side. We'll be posting our whip count on the House side. And we encourage folks to edit that, to go and talk to your own legislators, to report out on what you're hearing from your legislators, so that everyone's clear on where people are. We'll also be doing action alerts, based on the process. So as we're going through committee, going to a floor vote, we'll keep folks posted. But I'm sure that others have, similar things they'll be working on.
And the Act On Principles website is a wiki. You can go on and change that webcam,
Yeah.
Are you getting support from other, or anyone really, but support from other organizations outside of the LGBT realm in terms of pushing this? Like, I know Credo Mobile, put out an action alert today on something like a petition to sign or something like that. I saw it, but I'm just wondering, what kind of support you're getting from these sort of other larger progressive groups, maybe Move On, Credo, stuff like that. Are they on board?
Yeah. So we'll continue to have conversations with some of the kind of more online organizations, Credo, Move On, Democracy for America, other folks who have really large lists that extend far beyond just the LGBT community, partially to do public education, to reach the 90% of folks who think this is already law, but partially also just, to get more numbers.
How about OFA? Are the Obama people behind this?
I haven't had that conversation, but I can ask. That would be a good answer to Chris Johnson's question to the White House about what they're doing to push on it. So we'll be reaching out to some of those primarily online, we are reaching out to them to do pushes. We've also
That hasn't been available in the past, has it? I mean, not even with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that wasn't an option. I mean, that was, we didn't have support of other progressive groups like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying they weren't supportive, I'm saying they weren't
they weren't actively.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of those online progressive organizations are going to be helping out. A lot of labor organizations are going to be helping out. So SEIU is actually hoping to be here today. We have the support of SEIU, of the AFL, NEA, AFT, some of the other organized labor groups. And then we're also doing substantial outreach with the civil rights community. So there's a sign-on letter that, if it hasn't already gone out, it should be going out very soon, from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Most, if not all, of their organizations are signing on in support, which really kind of not only gives some moral authority behind the bill, but also, I think, gives some space for members of Congress who may not know how to vote. It's their kind of way of doing this, and kind of getting a sense of where the energy is and whether they have some cover to make the right decision that they know is the right decision, but to know that they have political and moral cover for that. Yeah. Anyone else want to add in? Or other questions?
Could there be a press effort to have the organizations you mentioned, plus NAA, plus some of the unions, to get together and with the folks around this table to say that there is, we want this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly be working, with some of the folks at the table, with Tico, with some of the larger LGBT and progressive groups to do that. And to make sure that it's not just organizations kind of coming on with a whimper, but really, putting out to their networks that they're supportive and that they want their constituents to be supportive, which I think is almost probably more important. So we'll be working on that in the next few weeks. Yep.
So to what degree do you think the effort to pass ENDA has been sidetracked by the focus on marriage equality?
Well, with marriage equality, always the big shiny ball, right? Everyone wants to talk about that. So, you know, I think Tico is actually, you know, exactly right on the sequence that we could potentially see over the summer, that instead of just, I think for a long time our movement has waited on marriage to end before we really pushed on ENDA. And I think there's actually an opportunity to use leverage and momentum from marriage to really move on ENDA, to actively use that kind of centrifugal force to move ENDA. So I think that Tico's right, and you know, we see a Supreme Court case decision, two Supreme Court case decisions this summer. We use that to help push on ENDA, and then all that energy kind of then builds on itself, right? So we're talking about marriage, we're talking about employment. That lets us talk about the Student Non-Discrimination Act. That lets us talk about housing protections. That lets us talk about credit. That lets us talk about all those other little stupid things that people think are already laws that we don't have protections around. So I think that, you know, in some ways, you know, certainly, you know, attention, press, money has gone toward marriage because it's the kind of, you know, sexy thing since there's a Supreme Court case. But, you know, I think that once you have the in to talk with folks about marriage, then you can talk about what that actually looks like, right? So now you can get married. Okay, well, maybe you can't buy a house in Mississippi because you can't get credit because you're gay. You know, it allows you to kind of make that more tangible for folks like my parents in Kentucky who have no idea what all of this craziness is about, right? Because they're just not in it all the time. So you can look at it as, you know, taking attention away, or you can look at it as, you know, trying to build momentum. I think right now we have no choice other than to use it to build momentum.
But what if the case goes against you? What if the ruling goes against you?
Well, then I think that you say...
I mean, you still have a conversation about it, but you don't have the momentum, maybe? Or?
Oh, I think that you actually probably still have... Right, every organizer wants to have, you know, the bad guy who you can shake your fist at.
Yeah, but the fight for marriage will still be on.
Absolutely.
So wouldn't that...
Yeah, as a matter of resources.
Crowd out ENDA as an issue because you'll be doing a state-by-state battle.
Yeah, as a matter of resources, I think that's the conversation that we need to have movement-wise. As you know, if there's a big Supreme Court loss, then where do the resources go for the movement? As far as, you know, having someone you can shake your fist at and then rally people around. You know, God, you know, there was no bigger organizing moment than Prop 8, right? Like that was a devastating loss for California, but damn if it didn't pull people off the couch, right? So I'm not trying to, you know, I don't want a loss, but I think that, you know, we have the choice then to use a loss to ultimately get a win.
What I see as one of the challenges, and I don't know if this can be addressed here, but ENDA is no longer a gay men with money problem, you see, and that's why we were able to zip right over it from marriage, because first age was the big issue. It was a bunch of wealthy white gay men who their friends were dropping dead, so they came out, and I'm talking about the money that came in, and then next came up ENDA, but then all of a sudden, wait a minute, we're all running Fortune 500s, and we're going to big dinners and all that, so we don't need ENDA, but we want is marriage. That's why if you look in the LGBT press, the next big thing is aging, because all those guys are getting old and they want fabulous places to live in Sun City, and they're not worried about poor transgender seniors on the street who don't have food. So what I think the challenge is here is to keep this relevant to the people that make things happen in this country, unfortunately, which is, you know, the levels that are calling the shots with these millions, which is why marriage happened in New York was a really, I mean, a lot of things, but business coming to the table is what really helped, and that's the challenge. And because you know these guys, they're like, well, you know, I work at Wells Fargo, and I have, you know, what I need, and I don't know how we do that, but it's important.
Yeah, I hear you, and I know that I'm in the middle of the New York, I know exactly.
My mother was friends with your mother, I know.
Oh. No, but I mean, the point that you're just talking about now. But you see, this is going back to the question that you raised. See, this is the issue in terms of, you know, organizing outside of that elite. And in my view, our movement made a mistake.
Just one?
Well, we made many, but that putting all the eggs, and this is the conversation I've had with a lot of activists in New York and legal folk and others, putting all of our eggs in marriage, you know, really diverted, because the a lot of young people too, by the way, a lot of young people I know, they don't care about marriage. They really don't. I mean, and so, you know, I say, I don't know, why are you assuming? I'm talking 20s and, you know, 20-year-olds. And so right now, in a way, I agree with you, Heather, you know, but the question he asked is, what if we have a defeat? Yes, it can be spur. But I think we have to get back out there and educate the country beyond the guys with the money. And then we have to tell them, too, that they've got to get on the program, which is, and be tough about the fact that, you know, this is a mess. We have to reignite the movement of people and bring in new people to say, this is what we need, full equality. How do you get to full equality? And I think we've avoided that. I think a lot of people in our movement across the country, you know, people with money have hold the shots, and that is okay in a certain respect, but it's cut out a lot of the people in this country, gay people in this country.
I agree 100%.
No, I know you do, but I really think this is something we have not dealt with head on. And in New York, at the Gay Center, myself and some others, we had a very unique first-time ever meeting of pulling in Ben Gels, the head of NAACP, and unions and gay rights groups, and to have a meeting, a forum about the next wave of what we organized, the next wave of civil rights, which would include, is the broader element of not just workplace, you know, banning discrimination in the job, but in every other way, housing, and you're talking about aging, and there are a lot of people in this country now that are looking very closely about aging and, you know, creating senior places in, you know, for gay and lesbians, you know that. But I think we have not dealt with this, you know, going back and organizing. I'm so glad when Heather got in touch with me because it really needs that. And the mass of a movement can override the men or the people with the money.
That's the mass we need to create. I mean, that's what I want.
Yeah.
We need to override them, or at least to
push
and
it.
If they're not, and they don't care now. They're building retirement homes in some cities.
I know.
They're building $54 million retirement communities in Philadelphia that most of my friends won't be able to afford to live there.
I know.
They won't be able to live there, and that's
exactly.
we need to move those guys.
I think the key lesson that our movement has learned over the past couple of years in looking at the power, the crushing power that the Dreamers have created, when you create moral crisis, you win. And I mean, that was a total reversal of power, right? These are folks who are young, who are undocumented, who, you know, either don't have jobs or can't have jobs, or are underground working on, you know, who are working underground jobs, and they were able to create the moral crisis that totally changed the political calculus. And if Dreamers can do it, many, many of whom are LGBTQ, then we can do it. That's the model that we're using, is look at what works.
And they're taking real risks.
Absolutely.
You know, you may lose a job or be deported back to your country. Two big differences.
We've got to, like Liz said, we've got to capture the imagination of the movement, of the grassroots movement, and use that capturing of imagination to build a grassroots LGBT movement. You know, it's the grassroots has stymied, and we've got to inject the grassroots with, you know, with that power again. You know, give folks back their power. They've decided that they don't have it. So I think there is actually a lot of space. I think that then donors and funders and other folks will have to either follow the plan that they've created or follow the movement. And you know, that's going to have to be a decision that they make.
Exactly.
In 1993, marriage was in the third section, and it was the very last section of the March on Washington platform. The word marriage appeared once in that, like, very long platform. But just one more thing in response to what you said is, movements don't pick, this is one of my taglines, is movements don't pick issues, but issues pick movements. We didn't pick marriage now, it kind of arrives, and we have to deal with it. Okay? And, you know, even if it's like, wait, this isn't the order we thought we were going to do it. It's like, you know, because politicians and people at much different places, and people walking into courtrooms saying, yeah, I'm in court, and it has to be dealt with.
So,
yeah, I do have a question. This might be a question for the task force. Do we have statistics on where, and sort of way to find this out, where these incidents of employment discrimination are happening? kind of regional-wise? I mean, is it mostly happening in the South, or is it more like in areas with more population? Maybe it's actually happening more like it's New York and California, where there's more people.
Right. So we actually can't break the statistics out like that because we ask people where they live currently and have they ever experienced discrimination. So a person may be living in San Francisco now, but they may have experienced discrimination when they were still living in Utah. So actually, there's no way to actually geographically, without asking where was each incident of discrimination, it's almost impossible to do. So no, we actually don't we can't say for sure where the discrimination is happening. We do have state-by-state breakout sheets that do say what people report, but there's no guarantee that that discrimination happened in that state. It's just currently where they live.
Aren't you planning on updating this? There's going to be another iteration of this. Will that include those questions, you think? Or?
It is too premature to be able to say, you know, this is basically a 4-year study, so we're still going with the existing numbers.
I will say, though, to add that, as a native Southerner, I fully expected, right, to see Southern states, Midwestern states, that's where folks experience the most discrimination. When we've gone out to our community and asked folks for stories of discrimination and where they live or lived at the time, what's shocking to me is the number of stories from California, Massachusetts, New York. Those actually equal the number from South Dakota and Oklahoma and Texas. So, you know, when I say that, you know, a federal law it's something, you know, psychological, right? That actually, I think that bears out, at least anecdotally. We don't have the statistics to back it up, but anecdotally, you know, you can find bigots anywhere you live.
Right, and there's also a lot of folks, trans and LGBT, you do a lot of avoidant and protective behaviors about being closeted or not being, or deciding not to gender transition, etc. So, so that's the other thing that is often not measured by surveys on discrimination is, well, how many folks are actually in the closet because they're afraid.
One question about this, your study, how big was that? I mean, in terms of, how did you get, you know, pull the data?
It was 6,452 people in the U.S. Yeah, online as well as paper surveys, available in English and Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually, we had all 50 states, several territories represented, and it looked basically like the country looked.
Uh-huh.
So I realize that we're over time, so I want to be respectful of our hosts at Center for Community Change. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists who are able to join us. Thank you to all of you who are able to join us. We'll post this up on YouTube either tonight or tomorrow so that other